There are few writers in the entire genre of horror as paramount and critical to the genre's continuing endurance than one Howard Phillips Lovecraft, more commonly known as H.P. Lovecraft. Born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1890, Lovecraft lived a very messy, complicated life with several ups and downs that in itself could make for an entire video of its own. But what matters is his iconic body of work that would leave a permanent and meteoric impression on the entire sphere of horror fiction for the rest of the 20th century all the way to today. Before Lovecraft's time, horror was the realm of creators like Poe, Stoker, Shelley, Stevenson, Oscar Wilde, Sheridan Le Fanu. The zeitgeist of horror during this time was gothic horror, stories of family curses, haunted mansions, vengeful ghosts, human hubris and malice made flesh, supernatural evils facing off against pious and faithful human heroes. All of that changed when Lovecraft entered the scene. His brand of horror was unlike anything readers had ever seen. Metaphysical creatures from beyond our own reality, extraterrestrial deities slumbering beneath our very sea, stories of occult hedonism and blasphemy in the name of indescribable alien powers, stories of beings and entities whose very presence and appearance are so incomprehensible to all the human senses that for any human being to behold them would induce an incurable madness. The bleak realization that humanity is nothing more than a mere speck of dust in a vast universe of inconceivable powers and entities. This was Lovecraft's pioneering niche, known today as cosmic horror. Stories like the Dunwich Horror, The Color Out of Space, At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow Out of Time, Nyarlathotep, The Haunter of the Dark, and way more. But this wasn't the only realm of horror Lovecraft explored. Throughout his stories are themes of hereditary degradation. Stories like The Rats in the Walls, The Lurking Fear, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and The Case of Charles Dexter Ward told stories of characters inheriting monstrous truths and fates tied to their very own family lines, and how sometimes a person's life is better without the full knowledge of their own lineage. Though Lovecraft would very sadly die in total poverty and obscurity, his body of work would take on a life of its own in the following decades thanks to the efforts of contemporary writers and friends of his like August Derleth and Clark Ashton Smith, who would labor intensively to preserve all the legendary writer's short stories and novellas for future generations. And that preservation would influence the creation of countless other writers and creators in the decades to come. Stephen King, Neil Gaiman, S.T. Joshi, Guillermo del Toro, John Carpenter, all some of the biggest names to cite Lovecraft as one of their most critical idols. Whether it's through music, video games, tabletop pen and paper RPGs like the insanely famous role-playing game by Chaosium, the water ripples of Lovecraft's dread-filled prose are still being felt across the entire spectrum of culture well through the 2020s. And will likely continue to be felt for decades to come. So you would think that for such an important figure, there'd be some pretty definitive film adaptations of Lovecraft's work, right? Well, no. Make no mistake, there's been lots of movies made based on his stories. Some of the best examples being 1985's Reanimator, 2019's Color Out of Space, and 1991's The Resurrected, which was a pretty faithful adaptation of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. There's also been lots of films made that, while not directly based on Lovecraft's stories, were very heavily inspired by them. Movies like The Void, In the Mouth of Madness, The Lighthouse, and Event Horizon, to even heavy-hitting horror classics like Alien and The Thing. But there's never been that tentpole, iconic, trailblazing, passionate, Peter Jackson-esque masterpiece adaptation of any of Lovecraft's yarns. There's a reason for that. You see, old Howard's writing style tends to be something of a square peg that lots of filmmakers struggle to fit into the round hole that is visual, cinematic storytelling. Lovecraft's main strength was never his immaculate plot structure, deep characterization, or the detailed visual descriptions of his monsters and demons that are often described as being indescribable, but the sheer, thick, oppressive, atmospheric canvas that his prose paints. as well as the fascinating and disturbing nihilistic and metaphysical ideas that his stories ignite in the reader's mind. There's a lot of abstractions there, and that kind of thing is damn hard to pull off well with movies. But there is one movie that I decided to pick for this video that I think comes pretty close to honoring that bleak and extra-dimensional terror that old Howard did so well. That film happens to be a direct adaptation of probably his most famous and iconic short story, The Call of Cthulhu. This film version of the legendary pulp story is a black and white silent film that wasn't made in the 20s, but the far-off distant year of 2005. Yes, this is a 21st century film painstakingly made to emulate the look and feel of the horror movies of Lovecraft's own time. A brilliant idea that helps the movie hold up incredibly well 20 years later. The plot follows a young man named Francis Wayland Thurston, whose granduncle hands him a series of papers and documents on his deathbed that recount the uncle's experience investigating the activities of a horrific cult that worships a being known as Cthulhu, a humanoid cephalopod-headed, dragon-winged priest of an all-powerful race of alien deities known as the Great Old Ones. As Thurston pores through his granduncle's notes, he becomes more and more obsessed and mortified of the implications of this cult's origin and the presence of Cthulhu himself, which culminates in the climactic flashback scene where a Norwegian ship crew happen upon the cursed corpse city of R'lyeh, Cthulhu's unholy resting place, and awaken the titular creature itself from his nautical slumber. The film was independently made with a very modest budget of around $50,000. The director, Andrew Lehman, is a lifelong fanatic of Lovecraft and part of a group of like-minded fans known as the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, who are the producers and distributors of the film. The fact that the filmmakers were all dedicated fans and scholars of Lovecraft's work is very evident when you watch this film. This is an insanely faithful adaptation of the original story, to the point where you could almost say that if you watch the film, you've basically read the story. But I wouldn't make a claim like that, since you can't recreate the sheer vibes and feelings of dread that Lovecraft's prose inspires when you actually read his work, as opposed to watching it. Despite the limited budget, the filmmaker's passion for the source material is obvious, with several moments that use famous passages from the story and the amount of detail that went into the production design and the attempt to emulate the style of filmmaking that silent films were known for. I especially love the visual design of Cthulhu's domain of R'lyeh. The set pieces used for this scene were clearly influenced by German expressionist classics of the 20s, like Faust, Caligari, Metropolis, and Nosferatu, which is ingenious when you think about it. The way Lovecraft describes R'lyeh in the original story is a city of cyclopean masonry and non-Euclidean geometry, which is basically an uber-fancy way of saying that the shape and architecture of the city doesn't conform to any laws of physics or reality. And what better way to visually depict a location like that than with German Expressionism, a visual style of filmmaking known for its surreal and nightmarish vistas and set pieces. The animation on Cthulhu himself is also very well done. I feel like stop motion is the perfect way to depict an indescribable immaterial terror like him, though if you're going into this movie hoping for non-stop Cthulhu action, you're gonna be disappointed since he only shows up in the last 10 or so minutes. But it's the same for the original story as well. Lovecraft's stories were less about the monsters themselves and more about the presence and the implications of those monsters, as well as not knowing about what's really out there in the endless voids of space and the wall cracks between realities is better than knowing. Despite the humble production values, this movie nevertheless succeeds at creating a vintage, classic, creepy atmosphere that harkens very strongly to Lovecraft's ideas and themes. Another great thing about this film is its length. At only 47 minutes of runtime, it's not much of a time commitment at all, and you'll be so hooked into the narrative that you'll barely notice the time fly by. If you want a great entry point into the realm of cosmic horror, it's hard to do much better than this. And with just how hoard out the Cthulhu characters become in the last couple decades, this movie bucks the trend by showing him to be the terrifying presence that Lovecraft intended.